At 4:47 in the morning on May 11, 1945, the jungle near Dingolan Bay, Luzon, Philippines was quiet. Too quiet. A thin layer of mist hung over the damp ground. The tropical forest smelled of wet soil, rotting leaves, and gun oil. Somewhere deep in the trees a night bird called once, then fell silent. Inside a small canvas tent, Private John McKinney slept on a thin army cot. His M1 Garand rifle rested beside him. That rifle would save his life in the next 36 minutes. But John McKinney did not know that yet. He was 24 years old, a farm boy from Screven County, Georgia, and he had already survived more than most men his age. For nearly 2.5 years, he had fought in the Pacific War. He had seen jungles burn. He had watched men die beside him. He had marched through mud that swallowed boots and mosquitoes that carried fever. And now, on this quiet morning, he slept only a few yards away from something that was already moving through the darkness. The enemy in the jungle. About 100 Japanese soldiers were creeping toward the American position. They moved slowly, silently. Each man stepped carefully over roots and vines. Rifles were wrapped in cloth to prevent metal from clinking. Bayonets were already fixed. At their head walked Sergeant Fukahiro Mori, a veteran soldier hardened by years of fighting. He raised one hand. The column stopped instantly. Ahead of them, through the trees, faint shapes of tents could be seen. American tents. The small outpost belonged to Company A, 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division. The Americans had established it to guard a supply route near Dingolan Bay, an important line that moved ammunition and food to advancing U.S. forces in Luzon. To the Japanese command, destroying that outpost meant slowing the American advance. And tonight they intended to wipe it out completely. Mori turned and whispered to the men behind him. No gunfire. No shouting. Kill the first soldiers with bayonets and swords. Once the perimeter collapsed, the rest of the force would rush in. The attack would take less than 5 minutes. That was the plan. The American camp. Inside the American perimeter, most soldiers were asleep. The jungle humidity had soaked their uniforms. Mosquito nets hung loosely above their cots. A few guards watched the darkness. But the jungle had been quiet all night. No movement. No sound. It felt safe. 30 yards from McKinney's tent stood a light machine gun position, protected by sandbags. 3 American soldiers had been manning it earlier. But McKinney had just finished his shift. After hours sitting behind the weapon, he had walked back to his tent, placed his M1 rifle beside the cot, and collapsed into sleep. The machine gun was now operated by Private James Hendricks and another soldier. They were tired. They were not expecting what was coming. A boy who learned to hunt. John McKinney had grown up far from jungles. His world had been pine forests and cotton fields in Georgia. His father was a sharecropper, a man who worked land owned by others. The family struggled constantly. There was rarely enough money. But there was always the woods. John learned early that hunting meant survival. If he could shoot a rabbit, the family ate. If he could bring down a deer, they had meat for weeks. By age 12, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a small rifle. He learned patience. He learned silence. He learned to move through trees without making a sound. These were skills that would later make him something far more dangerous than a typical soldier. The Pacific War. When America entered World War II, McKinney enlisted in November 1942 at Fort McPherson, Georgia. Army instructors quickly discovered something unusual. He struggled with reading. His education had ended in the 3rd grade. But on the firing range he was unstoppable. His marksmanship scores were among the best in the entire training group. Drill sergeants began watching him closely. This quiet farm boy had instincts that could not be taught. Soon he was shipped across the Pacific. He fought in New Guinea, surviving some of the worst jungle combat of the war. Malaria. Japanese ambushes. Months passed. Men around him died. But McKinney endured. By May 1945, he had become a veteran soldier hardened by combat. The silent approach. Back in the jungle near Dingolan Bay, the Japanese assault force had reached the outer perimeter. One American guard stood watching the darkness. He never saw the figure that appeared behind him. A hand covered his mouth. A blade flashed once. The guard collapsed silently. The path into the camp was open. Sergeant Mori signaled forward. Japanese soldiers slipped between tents like shadows. Their objective was the machine gun position. If they captured it, they could turn the weapon against the American camp and slaughter everyone inside. Inside the tent. At 4:51, Mori reached McKinney's tent. He could hear breathing inside. One American soldier sleeping. He slowly lifted the tent flap. Moonlight revealed the outline of McKinney lying on the cot. Rifle beside him. Mori raised his samurai sword. One clean strike. That was all it would take. The blade came down. But in the darkness, Mori misjudged the distance. Instead of slicing cleanly through McKinney's neck, the sword struck the side of his head. The blade cut deep. Part of McKinney's right ear was severed instantly. Blood exploded across the tent. McKinney's eyes opened. Pain shot through his skull like lightning. For a split second he saw only darkness. Then he saw the silhouette of a man standing above him with a sword raised again. There was less than 1 second to react. Most soldiers would have died right there. But John McKinney was not most soldiers. Instinct. His hand found the rifle beside the cot. He didn't aim. He didn't think. He swung the M1 Garand like a club. The heavy walnut stock smashed into Mori's jaw with bone-breaking force. The Japanese sergeant staggered. McKinney swung again. The second blow crushed the man's skull. Mori collapsed onto the dirt floor of the tent. Outside, McKinney heard something that froze his blood. Footsteps. Not one. Dozens. The main attack had begun. The realization. McKinney stepped out of the tent, blood streaming down the side of his face. The jungle was erupting with gunfire. Shouting. Explosions. Japanese soldiers were already pouring through the perimeter. Near the machine gun position, figures were fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness. The attack had come faster than anyone expected. And then McKinney saw the worst part. The machine gun pit. Japanese soldiers were already climbing over the sandbags. If they captured that gun and turned it toward the American camp, the entire outpost would be wiped out within minutes. McKinney started running. Straight toward them. The cold air of the Vosges forest hung heavy that morning. Frost clung to the pine needles, and the ground beneath the American soldiers was damp and unforgiving. After the chaos of the first German probe the night before, the men of the small American unit barely had time to catch their breath. They knew the enemy would return. And when they did, they would not come quietly. Hill 623 had suddenly become one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire sector. From that elevation, whoever controlled the hill could observe the surrounding valleys, roads, and forest paths that the German army relied on to move troops and supplies. Losing the hill would open the door for a German counterattack that could stall the entire Allied advance through eastern France. But the Americans holding it were not a large force. In fact, they were barely more than a reinforced squad. Just 12 men. 12 exhausted soldiers standing between the German army and the road to the valley below. The men had spent the early hours reinforcing their positions. They dug shallow foxholes among the roots of towering trees, stacked fallen logs as cover, and placed their machine gun where it could command the narrow trail winding toward the hilltop. Every man understood the same thing. If the Germans came in force, retreat might not be possible. And then, just after sunrise, the forest came alive. At first it was subtle. A distant crack of a twig. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of boots moving carefully through brush. The German soldiers were coming again. This time in greater numbers. Through the dense fog rolling between the trees, dark shapes began to appear. German infantry moved carefully through the woods, spreading out in small groups as they advanced toward the American position. They believed the hill was lightly defended. They were right. But what they did not know was how determined those 12 soldiers were to hold it. The first German rifle shot shattered the quiet forest. Within seconds, gunfire exploded across the hill. American rifles cracked sharply from behind logs and foxholes. The machine gun roared to life, its steady bursts tearing through the trees and forcing the advancing German troops to dive for cover. The element of surprise had vanished. Now it was simply a brutal fight for survival. German soldiers attempted to maneuver through the woods, using the thick trees for cover as they pushed toward the hilltop. They fired back with rifles, submachine guns, and grenades that exploded with sharp thunder among the rocks and roots. The Americans responded with disciplined fire. Every bullet mattered. With so few men defending the hill, they could not afford to waste ammunition. Each soldier carefully picked his target, squeezing the trigger only when he knew the shot would count. The machine gunner became the center of the defense. His weapon controlled the narrow path leading up the slope, forcing every German soldier attempting to climb toward the hilltop to risk running directly into a storm of bullets. Again and again, German troops tried to push forward. Again and again they were forced back. The forest amplified every sound: the crack of rifles, the rattle of the machine gun, the explosions of grenades. Smoke drifted between the trees, mixing with the cold fog and making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Still, the Germans kept coming. They outnumbered the Americans nearly 10-1. And they knew it. Gradually, German squads began spreading wider around the hill, attempting to flank the defenders from multiple directions. Small groups crawled through the underbrush, hoping to slip close enough to throw grenades into the American positions. The fighting became chaotic. Shots were fired at shadows. Grenades exploded just yards from the foxholes. One American soldier was knocked flat by the blast of a nearby explosion, his ears ringing as dirt rained down around him. Another soldier dragged a wounded comrade deeper into cover while continuing to fire his rifle one-handed toward the advancing Germans. Despite the pressure, the small American force refused to break. They shifted positions when necessary, supported one another, and kept the machine gun firing whenever German troops attempted to rush the hill. At one point, a group of German soldiers managed to reach within 30 yards of the American line. For a moment, it looked as though the defenders might finally be overwhelmed. Then the machine gun opened up again. The burst cut across the slope, forcing the attackers to dive behind trees and rocks. The charge collapsed before it could reach the hilltop. But the Americans were beginning to feel the strain. Ammunition was running lower. Barrels were overheating. Hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. And the Germans were not giving up. As the hours dragged on, the enemy pressure only increased. More German soldiers arrived from the forest, bringing additional rifles and automatic weapons into the fight. They coordinated their attacks better now, firing from multiple directions while others attempted to creep closer through the brush. The defenders realized something chilling. This was no longer just a probing attack. The Germans intended to take the hill no matter the cost. For the 12 Americans defending Hill 623, the battle had turned into a desperate stand. Behind them lay the valley and the Allied advance. Ahead of them were more than 100 determined German soldiers. The outcome of the fight would depend on whether those 12 men could continue holding the line just a little longer. And the worst of the battle was still coming. For the 12 American soldiers holding Hill 623, the battle had already lasted longer than anyone expected. The cold morning had turned into a gray afternoon, and the forest around them was no longer quiet wilderness. It had become a battlefield filled with smoke, broken branches, and the echo of gunfire. But what the defenders did not yet realize was that the Germans were preparing their most dangerous assault yet. Somewhere deeper in the forest, German officers had begun reorganizing their scattered units. The earlier attacks had revealed something surprising to them. The Americans on the hill were few, very few. Yet they were fighting with a level of resistance that made it seem as if an entire platoon was defending the position. But the Germans had numbers. And numbers could eventually break even the strongest defense. So instead of another rushed attack, they began planning something different. A coordinated push from multiple directions. Back on the hilltop, the Americans were feeling the weight of the battle. The adrenaline that had carried them through the first hours was slowly fading, replaced by exhaustion and the creeping realization that the enemy surrounding them was growing stronger. One soldier carefully checked the remaining ammunition in his rifle. Not much left. Another adjusted the machine gun's barrel, which had grown dangerously hot after hours of firing. The gun had saved them several times already, stopping German advances before they could reach the foxholes. But even that weapon had limits. Below them, hidden among the thick trees and rocky ground, German soldiers were quietly moving into new positions. Instead of advancing directly up the trail again, they spread out across the forest slope. The next attack would come from everywhere at once. And then it began. The first sign was a sudden burst of automatic fire from the left side of the hill. Bullets snapped through the branches above the American foxholes, forcing the defenders to duck low behind their cover. Before they could even respond, more gunfire erupted from the opposite side. The Germans had begun their coordinated assault. Now the hill was under fire from multiple directions. Rifles cracked from the forest. Submachine guns rattled through the trees. Grenades exploded against rocks and roots, sending dirt and splinters flying through the air. The defenders were suddenly fighting on all sides. One American soldier shifted his position behind a fallen tree and fired 3 careful shots toward movement between the trunks below. Another crawled through the mud to deliver extra ammunition to the machine gun position. Every second mattered. Every bullet counted. But the Germans were closing in. Using the terrain to their advantage, small groups of German infantry advanced in short bursts, moving from tree to tree while others laid down covering fire. Their numbers were slowly tightening the circle around the hilltop. For the first time since the battle began, the American line began to bend. A grenade exploded dangerously close to one of the foxholes, throwing dirt and debris into the air. The soldier inside was shaken but still conscious. He wiped mud from his eyes, grabbed his rifle again, and kept firing. Another defender shouted a warning as several German soldiers attempted to rush the slope from the eastern side. The machine gun swung toward them. The weapon roared again, its powerful bursts tearing through branches and forcing the attackers to scatter back into cover. For a moment, the hill held. But the pressure kept building. More German soldiers were arriving. Somewhere among the trees, enemy officers were shouting orders in German, urging their men forward. They believed the American defenders were close to breaking. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. The 12 soldiers defending Hill 623 were running low on everything. Ammunition. Energy. Their radio had stopped working hours earlier, which meant they had no way of contacting friendly forces in the valley. No reinforcements were coming. No artillery support. No air support. They were completely alone. Yet somehow, they kept fighting. At one point during the battle, a small group of German soldiers managed to reach a rocky outcrop just 40 yards below the American line. From there they began firing directly into the hilltop defenses. It was the closest the enemy had come all day. If they advanced another 20 yards, the entire American position could collapse. The defenders knew it. One soldier grabbed 2 grenades, pulled the pins, and threw them down the slope toward the rocks. The explosions echoed through the forest. Smoke and dirt erupted around the German position, forcing the attackers to retreat once again. The line held, but barely. As the afternoon continued, the forest battlefield had turned into a brutal stalemate. The Germans controlled the slopes surrounding the hill, while the Americans clung stubbornly to the summit. Neither side was willing to back down. But there was one major difference. The Germans could afford losses. The Americans could not. If even a few more defenders went down, there might not be enough men left to hold the line. And deep in the forest, the German commanders were already preparing one final push. This time, they intended to overwhelm the hill completely. For the exhausted soldiers defending Hill 623, the coming attack would decide everything. Whether they would hold their ground, or the hill, and possibly the entire valley beyond, would fall back into German hands. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and it would be the most intense fight of them all. 4 hours, the 12 American soldiers had held the summit of Hill 623 against wave after wave of German attacks. The forest that morning had been silent and cold, but now it looked like something entirely different. Branches were shattered. The ground was torn apart by explosions. The air smelled of smoke, mud, and gunpowder. And the battle was far from over. Hidden among the trees below the hill, German officers were preparing one last assault. They had already thrown dozens of soldiers into the fight throughout the day, but the small group of American defenders still refused to give up the hill. To the Germans it made no sense. How could such a small force continue holding them back? But they were about to try again. This time with everything they had left. On the hilltop, the American soldiers were reaching the limits of their endurance. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and dirt, their hands trembling slightly from exhaustion after hours of constant combat. One soldier checked the ammunition remaining in his rifle. Only a few clips left. Another soldier looked toward the machine gun, the weapon that had saved them again and again throughout the battle. The barrel was nearly glowing from the heat. Yet it still worked. And they would need it one more time. Then, from the forest below, the attack began. German soldiers surged forward through the trees in larger numbers than before. Their rifles cracked loudly, and bursts from submachine guns ripped through the branches as they advanced toward the hilltop. This was no longer a probing attack. It was the final push. The defenders immediately opened fire. American rifles barked across the slope, carefully aimed shots striking at figures moving between the trees. The machine gun joined them moments later, unleashing powerful bursts that forced several attackers to dive for cover. But this time the Germans did not stop. They kept coming. More soldiers appeared behind the first wave, spreading through the forest and firing as they climbed toward the summit. Grenades exploded along the hillside, sending clouds of dirt and smoke into the air. For the first time that day, German troops managed to close the distance faster than before. 30 yards. 25 yards. The Americans could now see their enemy clearly through the smoke and broken trees. The battle had become brutally close. One American soldier leaned out from behind a fallen log and fired several rapid shots toward a group of advancing German infantry. Another defender threw a grenade that exploded directly in front of a cluster of attackers, slowing their momentum. But the pressure was enormous. German soldiers were pushing from multiple directions again, trying to surround the hilltop completely. For a moment, it seemed as if the defense might finally collapse. Then the machine gun roared once more. The gunner swung the weapon across the slope, firing controlled bursts that tore through the advancing line. The powerful weapon forced several German squads to scatter and dive behind trees. The advance stalled. But only briefly. The Germans regrouped quickly. They had committed too many soldiers to this attack to turn back now. And so they pushed again. Rifle fire cracked through the forest. Grenades burst against the hillside. Bullets snapped through branches only inches above the American defenders. The fight had turned into a desperate struggle where every second mattered. At one point during the chaos, a small group of German soldiers managed to reach a rocky position just below the hilltop. From there they opened fire directly into the American defenses. It was the most dangerous moment of the entire battle. If those soldiers managed to climb just a few more yards, they could overrun the defenders. One of the Americans reacted instantly. Grabbing 2 grenades from his belt, he crawled forward through the mud and smoke until he could see the enemy position clearly. Then he threw both grenades down the slope. The explosions echoed violently through the trees. When the smoke cleared, the German soldiers near the rocks had been forced to retreat once again. The hill was still in American hands. But the battle had pushed both sides to the limit. The forest was now filled with wounded soldiers, shattered branches, and the constant echo of gunfire fading slowly into the distance. Eventually something unexpected happened. The German attacks began to slow. At first it was barely noticeable. The bursts of rifle fire became less frequent. The movement between the trees became quieter. Then, little by little, the remaining German soldiers began pulling back deeper into the forest. They had tried again and again to capture Hill 623. And each time, the small American force had stopped them. After hours of brutal fighting, the German commanders finally realized something important. Taking the hill would cost far more men than they were willing to lose. So they withdrew. Slowly, carefully, leaving the hilltop in the hands of the same 12 exhausted soldiers who had defended it all day. For a long moment, the Americans simply remained in their positions, rifles still aimed toward the forest. None of them spoke. They were too tired, too stunned by what had just happened. But gradually, the realization spread among them. They had done it. Against more than 100 enemy soldiers. Against repeated attacks. Against overwhelming odds. They had held Hill 623. Their stand in the Vosges forest would become one of the most remarkable small-unit defenses of the war. 12 determined soldiers had stopped a much larger enemy force and protected the Allied advance moving through the region. Sometimes history is shaped by massive armies and huge battles, but other times, it is decided by a handful of soldiers refusing to give up a single hill. And on that cold day in the Vosges forest, Hill 623 belonged to them.